What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and just a couple weeks ago, I went to Adepticon. I was there for a couple of different reasons. I played 140k in the Adepticon Championships, using an insane list that I'll probably talk about in a video soon on this channel, as well as running cooperative games and demos for my game, Breachstorm, that I'll drop a link down in the video description for. But one of my favorite parts about Adepticon every year is checking out all of the new and unhinged games that everyone's coming up with. I demoed tons of games over the course of the weekend, and these ones are my favorite. Now, first things first, there were a ton of games that I took a look at but didn't get the opportunity to demo, and mostly appreciated from a purely aesthetic standpoint. The first one I want to call out is called Oasis, which, as someone who has been a Homeworld fan for my entire life, absolutely scratched that itch. This is an extremely small scale, 6mm scale game that focuses around scavenging and resource recovery in a fraught battlefield with fighting between tanks, infantry, and airships. The big focus was on those aircraft, which included up to basically like frigate-class spacecraft that would come in and hover around the battlefield. I think they were running scheduled demos for the game. Unfortunately, I just booked the entire weekend, so I didn't get the opportunity to play one. They did have a showcase at their booth, which looked incredible, and that was basically the entirety of my association with that game. Probably also important to throw in a couple of additional mentions in here. The first one being the Starcraft miniature game, which was kind of the highlight of the show. I didn't get a chance to demo this game, but given that the rules have been up and have been scrutinized dozens of times over the last couple of weeks, I think we know most of what we need to about this game. And there was a lot of buzz, and Archon Games booth was insanely busy the entire time. They only had, I think, 1 or 2 demo tables for Starcraft throughout the entire weekend, which means it was constantly mobbed. It was very difficult to get a showcase of the game's mechanics there. However, there are lots of videos on YouTube at this point. Obviously, the game looks great. It's StarCraft, and we love StarCraft, so that's pretty cool. The other one was Grave Trigger from Cardboard Dynamo, who are friends of the channel. We've done some promotional work for them in the past when they originally launched their Game Found, which I'm happy to say did fund successfully, and they are now in the midst of fulfillment. If you watched my initial review of that game, Grave Trigger has some incredibly unique and absolutely unhinged aesthetics and mechanics. It's got this kind of anime-inspired Giger-esque biomechanoid aesthetic to the miniatures and terrain features, as well as a really interesting system that removes dice rolling from the game entirely, as well as most of the measuring that you need to do. Essentially, your characters are assumed to be agile enough to move anywhere they need to on the battlefield and make use of your abilities. You have to be able to accurately predict what your opponent is doing in order to use your effects. And the only variance comes from the combination of what you and your opponent choose to do each turn. It's a very different style of gameplay than you've ever seen before, and the miniatures are just as unique, so I highly recommend you checking it out. I was going to put another section here about a spaceship game that I thought looked pretty neat, but looking deeper into the game upon recording this video, I actually realized that almost all their assets were AI generated. The miniatures they did produce themselves, but for whatever reason under a separate brand name. But basically the rest of the game was AI Slop. I might do a video on it on my second channel, but obviously I won't be covering it here. Also, that's why this transition is so awkward. Here we go. And speaking of aesthetics, let's talk about one of my favorite games that I played over the course of the weekend, that being Malediction. This game had a massive presence, an enormous booth, dedicated demo tables, as well as an expansive product selection, which is all very cool. And while it wasn't necessarily new this year, it ended up crowdfunding via Game Found around this time last year and is now being fulfilled. It had a pretty interesting pitch. First of all, it's fully 3D printer friendly and actually pseudo miniature agnostic. The game actually provides standee miniatures that you can purchase kits of and play with without actually having to use the miniatures themselves. Although I imagined that if you were to play an organized play, you would have to have either the correct standee or the correct miniature in order to play. But the pitch for this game is that it's a hybrid between a classic skirmish miniature game and a deck-building card game. Each faction is represented by a character who brings with them a deck of cards, which represent units, upgrades, and special spells that they can cast over the course of the game. These cards can be used both as a resource in and of themselves, allowing you to throw away powerful cards in order to bid for initiative, which is important since the game is alternating activation, so being able to hold powerful cards in your hand to try to double activate your characters from turn to turn is a big deal, but you can also spend a persistent resource to cast them, which allows you to equip cards from your deck to your characters to give them attack bonuses, or even summon new units to the battlefield. The integration of the card mechanics and the miniature mechanics were really interesting, and the game did a lot to kind of play around the variance that you normally get from a dice-based miniature game, because if you tend to add deck or card variants to a game that is variant by itself, you sort of compound the issue. You add those two things together and the game becomes super random, so the actual combat on the battlefield is relatively consistent. Your miniatures have an attack value, which represents the minimum amount of damage they will always do by spending actions to attack. However, rolling high can give you a small amount of bonus damage. That makes the gameplay on the table feel very simple and very good, but a lot of the complexity is added by those card mechanics. At least with the experience of the demo, the playtime of the game seems pretty light. I could definitely see a game taking no more than an hour or so to get through. A lot of games tout that, but then between setup and all sorts of other things going on, it ends up not actually working out that way. But the combat mechanic is so fast and the card mechanics are so well integrated that it doesn't seem like a resolution takes very long. However, you're not generally playing with more than 4 or 5 models at a time, so the scale of the game is very small. The aesthetic is pretty cool as well. It's extremely Dark Souls inspired, just to an absolutely insane degree. They provide STLs for 3D printable terrain, and it looks just like something out of Avalon or any of the Dark Souls games or Elden Ring. It fits perfectly into that aesthetic. So if that's something that you like, this game is sick, and the gameplay is incredibly solid. Now, the next game I want to talk about is actually the brainchild of a bunch of real OGs in the industry. Those being Death Ray Designs and Ash Barker, who you might recognize as Guerrilla Miniatures games. This is Steel Rift, which is a mech combat skirmish game. It's very small scale. It seems like you will typically not play with a vast number of miniatures, although each of those miniatures does represent a multi-ton war machine. The game is relatively simple. An interesting mechanic is that there are no attack dice. Unlike most other games, it is assumed that the technology of the universe is more powerful enough that your attacks are going to be able to target enemy mechs pretty effectively. So mechs only roll to evade damage rather than to deal damage. Being hit by missiles and railguns and cannon shots is probably going to deal damage to you regardless, so it's all about your ability to use cover, lines of sight, and the small, nimble nature of your smaller mechs in order to evade that, or use simply layered armor plating and structural improvements on your larger mechs to absorb that damage. Now, the game in general is very straightforward. It's alternating activation, and a lot of the attack sequences are pretty prescriptive. However, one thing I did like about it is that it has special weapon keywords that have pretty dramatic impacts on how attacks are resolved. One of them that was showcased very heavily in the demo was the kinetic weapon keyword, which upon hitting an enemy mech can potentially cause it to spin out and actually rotate, which changes its facing on the battlefield. So you can use these weapons in order to mess with your opponent's ability to see you or your ability to hit their weaker side or rear armor facings. I think that's neat, and it allows weapon combos to be assembled, whether that is within a single mech or within multiple mechs that you want to combo together over a couple activations in interesting ways. The game also touts a lot of modularity in its list building. Essentially, factions will have very limited selections of light, medium, or heavy mechs, and when you purchase the 3D printed miniatures, they come with alternate weapon slots that you can use to customize those mechs. However, the mechs are also capable of downgrading their own weapon loadout in order to take things like improved structure or improved armor values, which gives you a ton of control over how your robots are laid out. While there's not a ton of flexibility within the actual number of mechs that you're taking, you could take a couple of lower numbers of larger mechs in order to take a couple of lighter ones, for example. That's not particularly granular. However, the granularity comes from actually loading out those mechs in unique ways in order to attain those interesting weapon combinations that we discussed earlier. There were a couple of clunky mechanics within the game. For example, the way the game treats system damage was a little bit hard to parse. It's based on the proportion of your structural hit points that your mech has remaining. So it works kind of like bracketing in Warhammer 40k. However, each of the brackets affects different things. So based on the proportion of hit points you have left, it might affect your movement versus your weapon attacks, which was a little bit weird to get your head around the first time you play. Although I'm sure with repeated playthroughs, it would be fine. Now, the last game I want to talk about was one that I think mechanically I'm a little bit less interested in, but the pitch for this game is maybe one of the best I've ever received. This is a game called Carnivore by Boer Games, which is currently on GameFound and at the time of recording has 10x'd its original goal. While obviously the miniature gaming space is inundated by fantasy, science fiction, and historical games, this game went kind of a different direction by being what is technically a historical game, but not necessarily this small segment of human history history, but in fact going all the way back to prehistoric times and representing combat between dinosaurs. The way that the game was pitched was that during an extinction event, as the dinosaurs went through several of them, and plant life around various habitats slowly died off, herbivores would also become scarcer, which caused conflict between different carnivorous species. And that's what you play in Carnivore. You choose a species of predator to play, which will essentially give you a number of models based on how powerful that predator is. You can play a Tyrannosaurus Rex and have one guy, or two Allosaurus, or a large swarm of smaller things like Velociraptors, each of which have their own unique abilities, unique playstyle. The competition is to consume as much dinosaur meat as you can, whether that be from the dinosaurs of your opponent, herbivores who are AI controlled and set up on the battlefield, or even your own guys. As your dinosaurs die, you can still eat them in order to accrue points. While the game does use scenarios, which can add some mutators to the gameplay, a big part of the game is the herbivore that you are going to be hunting. Each herbivore has dramatically different strengths and weaknesses, and so has to be approached in different ways. And of course, the matchup with your opponent and their interactions with that herbivore can change things quite a bit. Well, I will say that the combat mechanics of the game felt incredibly dicey and a little bit clunky. The idea is definitely to project a fantasy where combat between these carnivores is incredibly lethal and inconsistent. You never know when engaging in a fight whether you're going to get the best, whether that's going to end well for you or not, even if you are a larger dinosaur, and that's pretty well represented. That kind of cements this as a very classic beer and pretzels game. It's going to be throwing a lot of dice and sort of uncovering these insane stories of these dinosaurs as the dice create weird situations on the battlefield. Speaking personally, that's not a gameplay loop that I'm quite as interested in. I want player decision-making to be the real deciding factor between two players. However, my favorite thing about this game is simply that pitch. In an industry that is chock-a-block with science fiction and fantasy, going back to a real-life biology-inspired prehistoric game is absolute masterstroke. And I think this is going to be a popular one. Literally, as I was standing there getting a demo from the game designers, people were coming by and just backing the game sight unseen, which was insane. The miniatures are also great. They're very nice, classic little dinosaurs, and I think there's definitely a fantasy as well to modeling up prehistoric terrain features, grabbing out all those old aquarium jungle trees that everyone has in their closet somewhere and setting up a lush but slowly desiccating jungle as you hunt after a triceratops or something. Super cool idea for a game. I would wish it luck, but it seems like it doesn't need it because the Game Found is doing so well. And obviously, I would be remiss if I didn't mention my own game before I close things out. Breachstorm. Breachstorm is a science fiction skirmish game that was originally designed for competitive 1v1 play, so it has a tight rule set and attack mechanics. However, we've also added support for multiplayer play, 3 to 4 players on a single table, as well as cooperative narrative play. That particular game mode has been getting a ton of interest over the last year, and so we are doing a ton of work to actually revamp it, making it faster and easier to play with more interesting enemies that are going to be more unpredictable for you to fight against. You can check that out over at breachstorm.com. We've also added some fully scripted tabletop simulator mods, as well as list builders within Tabletop Simulator, so you can get on and play online for free. I will drop a link in the video description to that as well as to the Breachstorm Discord server, where people can find games at all hours of the day. But thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks to everybody who supports Tactical Tortoise and lets me get out to these events and check out these games, whether that's over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, or Twitch subscribers. All you people are amazing, and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.